Thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done to mark the centenary at the Imperial War Museum, and then particularly, as Victoria said, how we unearthed a little used collection and a little used archive in the Imperial War Museum, and used that to work with dozens, hundreds of organisations around the world particularly to tell the story of the contribution of women and the First World War. But for me to be able to tell this story, I first need to be able to tell you a little bit about the story of the Imperial War Museum. So although we've been marking the centenary of the First World War this year, we've also been marking our own centenary. The Imperial War Museum was established in March 1917. It was established by a man called Sir Alfred Mond. Now, Alfred Mond was the first Commissioner of Public Works, and one of his first acts in this role was to respond to public demand that by March 1917, there should be some sort of institution that marks not just the military contribution and the military experience of the First World War, but the civilian experience of the First World War. Because if you think by that point, by March 1917, there has been the enormous loss of life in the initial stages of the war, as we heard from earlier today, of the huge loss of life at Ypres and on the Western Front, but Jutland, Gallipoli, and more. And so by that point, there was this real, as I said, public demand that this is the Great War, this is the war to end all wars. This must be marked. And the initial plan was that the Imperial War Museum would, after the war, have a specific built building alongside a Hall of Remembrance that would have been in Hyde Park. As you can see, it didn't happen. We're not based in Hyde Park. That would be lovely. And there is no Hall of Remembrance. There's the Hall of Remembrance art collection. But for various different reasons, those two projects didn't happen. But the collection, they got started on collecting for the Imperial War Museum almost immediately. And one of the things that the first director appointed by Sir Alfred Mond, Martin Conway, he wanted to not just collect the stories of the officers and gentlemen, but to collect the everyday lives of the First World War, of all of those who'd made a contribution, who'd lived and died through the First World War. So people like these two gentlemen, Second Lieutenant Timothy Sullivan, who's the son of Michael Sullivan, who lived in Bantry. He grew up in Bantry. And he died of his wounds sustained at Gallipoli in 1915. And I can't believe I picked a name which was so difficult to say. Captain Henry Owen Dabridge Court Besher, and I knew I probably pronounced it wrong as well. And he fought on the Western Front and died on the Western Front. But he was the son of the Reverend Harry and his wife Zoe Besher from the Deanery in Rosscarbery. Besher. I'm a Lancashire. You should wait till I get onto some French pronunciations. That's really going to distress people. So you have to phone with the Lancashire vowels. So wanted to collect stories like these gentlemen. And the way in which Sir Martin Conway decided to do that was, yes, take out advertisements in newspapers, but not everyone took a newspaper. So the Imperial War Museum collection was that it was going to be collected by public subscription was advertised on the back of ration books. So then everybody would know and everybody would notice that this national collection to mark the Great War that would become at first the National War Museum until Sir Martin Conway was petitioned by the Dominion governments to say, no, please can you call it the Imperial War Museum, and please can you collect the whole experience of the then empire. So he wanted to collect stories like and records of gentlemen like these. And the reason those images are a little bit fuzzy is because they come from a scrapbook, a Bond of Sacrifice scrapbook, and this was the sort of material that as soon as that advertisement was put on the back of ration books, started to come to the address for the Imperial War Museum. So they collected photographs, they collected scrapbooks like these, where people would painstakingly cut out pictures and the accompanying newspaper articles of those who died during the First World War and create them into scrapbooks so that so they felt that somebody would have this scrapbook in years to come, and they were given to the Imperial War Museum. We have dozens of postcards, we have letters and diaries. We have, in some cases, one of only 2 photographs that exist of people where a husband wrote of his wife, I only have 2 photographs of her. Please pick the one. These are them both. Please pick the one you want and send the other one back to this address. She died in an explosion in a munitions factory. So it's a real personal collection. There's a lot of personal ephemera. As you can imagine, that founding collection is very large, and it is those individual stories and lives that have formed the basis of how we've marked the centenary of the First World War. People like Robert Harnett Hayes, who died at Ypres, but his body was never found. He was missing in action. He's recorded on the Men in Gates. And that he was featured in that scrapbook. And it means that 100 years on, I can stand very close to where he lived and where his family lived. And you can see a picture of him. And I can tell you a little bit about his story and about his contribution to the First World War. That's what Sir Martin Conway had in mind. The collection was augmented by official records. So these are from the Ministry of Defence records. The Royal Naval photographers were dispatched to then Queenstown to photograph the US Navy when the US Navy was stationed off the south of Ireland. So we have all of that material as well. And we collected from the front. And that's something we still do at the Imperial War Museum. We still collect from the battlefield. Our contemporary conflict curators go embedded with the army and collect from battlefields. This particular picture shows these wooden trench markers, which were the signposts in the trench. And we have displayed these in the museum pretty much like that. And certainly that top middle one is very prominent in the galleries in London. So they collected this material. This is a brilliant way of doing it. Collect the collection, but you haven't got a building to put it in. There was the very first exhibition of the Imperial War Museum collection was at the Royal Academy at Burlington House in the Royal Academy, where they tried to show all sorts of different contributions to the First World War, including that of women. I'll tell you a little bit of the story about women and war work and how the Imperial War Museum collected that in a little while. And then they moved, they decided obviously needed a permanent building, and made the then controversial decision to go south of the river. We're obviously still south of the river, but this is Crystal Palace. And the first Imperial War Museum was based at Crystal Palace, in the Crystal Palace. As you can imagine, what is essentially a giant conservatory is not great as a museum building. So they swiftly moved out of that and by 1929 we're based in Kensington, in what ironically has been the only art gallery we have ever had for our art collection. And they're based there towards the 1920s and early 1930s. It's a really good example, though, to show that the last set of items that came into the founding Imperial War Museum collection, which is the official First World War art collection. As you can see, and again, this has determined how we've worked with partners to commemorate the first and mark the centenary of the First World War. Much of what is in our art collection is absolutely enormous.
Where in Kensington are you?
Near the Commonwealth Institute, just opposite the Commonwealth Institute, which is now the Design Museum, if you want to orientate where that is. So as you can see, our art collection is large, and that's because much of it was commissioned during the conflict, but commissioned for that Hall of Remembrance that wasn't built, and it was meant to be grand, and it was meant to be large, and they commissioned the greatest artists of the day who did so on large canvases. And we moved to the building that we know and love, in Lambeth in the late 1930s. And this building was, and if you stand in it, it becomes very obvious, it was the Royal Bethlehem Hospital. And apparently the irony of putting the National War Museum in the building that was Bedlam absolutely lost on everyone. building was then extensively damaged during the Second World War, and some of the material that was collected for the First World War was damaged during the Second World War. So it's a fascinating story to tell through the different conflicts. So what have we done to mark the centenary of the First World War? Well, we took that building, which was never really changed, and we built new First World War galleries, and those opened in July 2014. Just a little tip, if you are interested in doing a major capital project, don't tie it to an international centenary that you are never going to change the date of, and the building turns out needs rewiring, but we did it. And it was actually the Duke of Cambridge, but who's a little bit easier to deal with the protocol, but you're right. Try and just lower your stakes. But what we wanted to do was really imbibe that spirit of how the museum was founded through the use of objects and through the use of individual stories and the lives of the First World War. So, for example, the story of the sinking of the Lusitania is told through this object of a life belt from the ship, but from this, it's a camisole worn by a lady called Margaret Guire. She was an American. She was coming across the Atlantic to meet her in-laws for the first time. And she, when the ship started to sink, she managed to get into a lifeboat. And then she fell off the lifeboat, and she was sucked into the funnels of the Lusitania. There was then an explosion, and it propelled her back out of the funnels, and she was scooped up, taken to safety. This is the camisole she was wearing, and she kept it. She never washed it. She just dried it. She never washed it. So all of this detail are the stains that she incurred during the sinking of the Lusitania. She gave it to the Imperial War Museum, and the little record that goes with it on our collections record is that she tells that story, obviously fairly matter of fact, but she tells that story, and then she says how mortified she was that she met her in-laws for the first time in such a state of dishevelment. And they're presumably just unbelievably glad she was still alive. But it shows how the war impacted on everybody's day-to-day life, that life carried on, but that the war impacted on every facet of life. And really the Imperial War Museum's basis is that every place and every person had a First World War story and has a First World War story. And if our aim then was to ensure that breadth of experience was reflected in the building, that we now continue to ensure that breadth of experience is told in the way that we've managed and worked with organisations through the centenary. The other things we've done are all the sorts of stuff you'd imagine a national museum to do. We've put on special exhibitions, and we've lent objects and artworks around the world. Victoria, you mentioned Noel Chavas earlier, which I really should have put up his portrait, because we lent that to Liverpool to mark the centenary of when he received his second of his 2 VCs. But obviously his father was from County Cork before he moved to work at Liverpool Cathedral. So that's one item that we lent to the Museum of Liverpool. This is one of those huge monumental artworks that was designed for the Hall of Remembrance. This is probably our star object. Every time we take this out of the Imperial War Museum in London, we have to take down a wall to get it out of its gallery. It is that large. So we did, and it went on a tour of the United States. It was in London for the start of the centenary, and now it's come home and it's in Manchester, along with 9 other of those monumental works for the Hall of Remembrance, and they are displayed alongside each other for the first time since we inhabited that building in Kensington. And that's in Manchester, and it's a fairly moving and affecting site.
How big is it?
So it is probably from there to the end of the tent. It is absolutely enormous. As is this one. It's not quite as large. This is Paul Nash was another one of the artists who obviously was a war artist, but was commissioned after the war to make works. This is his more kind of post-war light coming through the destruction, called We Are Making a New World. We're going to display that. It doesn't normally get displayed because these are so large. Display that in London, and we have an enormous programme of activities taking place between September this year and March next year. There are 5 exhibitions. Our director of exhibitions is the most tired, stressed person at the entire organisation at the moment, but a programme of events and things like that. Now, that's all the stuff you'd expect us to do. But we thought this is too important a moment for us to just do what you would normally expect a National Museum to do. We could have done that, and that would have been fine. But instead, we took those two things that I said earlier. Every place and every family, every person has a story of the First World War. And the other thing as we approached this centenary that we realised is this is probably the first international commemoration of the digital age. So that we have a whole set of tools and systems and ways of communicating and ways of remembering and ways of sharing information and sharing stories that hadn't been available to our predecessors. So we decided to launch a project called Lives of the First World War, which is a wish to make to create a digital memorial to the 8 million who experienced the First World War. As I said, not just those who served, but the lives, those who lived through the First World War. We're doing quite well. If you have stories that are not on Lives of the First World War, rather imaginatively, livesofthefirstworldwar.org, then please do put those onto that, place those onto the digital memorial. That will come into the Imperial War Museum, be accessioned for as a resource, as a record, as a memorial to be used for a long time in the future. Again, that spirit of we create a museum to document the experiences of all of those who experienced the war. The bit that I do, though, is, along with the sort of official commemoration, official centenaries, every place has a First World War story. And although the Imperial War Museum, with our 5 sites, is very large, it's a finite space. Those First World War galleries are 1,400 square feet. There's absolutely no way that we could tell everybody's story of the First World War. There's no way that we could represent that diversity of experience. And the experience of the First World War was so different depending on your geography, your class, your social economic status, your gender, your height even, as to whether in the first instance you fought or not. So we established something called the First World War Centenary Partnership, and we thought when we set this up we would lead a network of kind of like-minded organisations who were all looking at centenary projects, and that we would support them, facilitate them. We'd create this website, 1914.org, with an events calendar. You'd be able to sort of search out news, information of what people were doing. And we thought we'd probably have about 100, because we like to be a little bit modest in our... Anyway, we now have nearly 4,000, so it proves that through the centenary of the First World War there has been no diminishing in that kind of public appetite of finding more. And what we've noticed through the centenary is right at the start there was a rather kind of traditional almost way of looking into stories, that you were researching names on war memorials. There was a lot about service, there was a lot about kind of uniformed contribution to the conflict. There was a lot that was about the Western Front. As we come to 4 years through the centenary, those stories have multiplied and expanded in their geography. They've expanded in their focus, but also expanded in the kind of creativity and how that commemoration kind of manifests itself. So yes, we have museums, we have collections, we have community history groups and societies. We have an enormous number of performing arts organisations. I could probably put on a concert every single day from now until the end of the centenary. We have universities, we have schools, we have any number of cadets, scouts, bronies, young youth organisations. And we find that they are crossing. This is one thing that we've been really keen to do and work really hard, is we're trying to cross over those organisations. So just round the corner from us at Lambeth Road, there was a Zeppelin raid on the Walworth Road in 1917. And the local history society said, we'd like to come in and research that. We said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. But we also know there's a youth theatre group who are really interested in doing something, but they haven't got the raw materials to mark the raid. So the history society did the research, and then they passed all those stories to the youth theatre group, and they came up with a piece of immersive theatre that they wrote themselves and performed in Burgess Park on the anniversary of the raid. And that was a great way to mark the centenary, until we got kind of 2 years through and decided that we wanted to do something a little bit more. We've got more organisations there than we anticipated. We have I've mentioned a lot about how big the art collection is. You saw those pictures of the material that was collected at the, particularly collected at the Western Front. They are big, large objects. If I was maybe doing a similar sort of national project at another national museum, I might send objects out on tour. There are a very small number of places that have a floor that you reinforce enough to lend them a First World War gun. I explained how big Gast was. You need a very large wall. You need pretty important security to be able to take that. And we only found 4 institutions in the United States that were able to match the requirements for borrowing something like that. What we do have, though, is that we have 3 incredible collections. We have, and again, these are collections that we have that others don't, and that's what we wanted to share at the Imperial War Museum. We have a really astonishing sound archive taken of those who survived the First World War in the 50s, 60s and 70s, and we've made increasing use of that. We've got an enormous photograph archive, and we've also got an astonishing film archive because we had the films, the official films from the War Office and the Information Office, but we also have film that individuals took and then gave to the Imperial War Museum as part of that public request for information and detail. And the great thing about film and photography is that you can digitise that and then you can show it anywhere. And so you can take our collection and use it to tell, as the context to tell your local stories, and without the need for, as I said, a reinforced floor or a very large wall. The Battle of the Somme film is probably, along with Gast, the other star of our First World War collection. It was filmed in over the first 2 days of the battle, preparing for, and then the first 2 or 3 days of the Battle of the Somme. It's an indication, like photography, that between 1914 and 1916, as with many things that are science and technology based, that the science and technology by necessity moved on so quickly in that time, and that the equipment rather that you needed became so much more portable, that something like this could be done. It's a 60-minute documentary. It was the first film documentary ever created, and it's also important to the history of cinema because before then, going to the cinema was very much a working class activity. It was like an extension of Variety or the music hall. But such was that kind of, this way it's like with anything, kind of pragmatism overcomes principle. And so many people wanted to see what's the front line like, that the middle class started to go to the cinema, and that has never really changed since. Around about 1 million people saw the Battle of the Somme in 1917 when it finally made it to the cinemas. And so we wanted to replicate that, and we made the film available to members of the Centenary Partnership for free for them to screen across the UK and across the world, as would have happened in 1916, 1917 rather. We had a pleasingly round number of 350 screenings, and a further 100 where the composer who created a new score, because when it was digitally remastered we couldn't keep the score, that she did live orchestral screenings. And we had them we have one in the Royal Festival Hall, and we had them in community centres on the Isle of Skye. We had them in Rochdale Working Men's Club, and we had them in the Town Hall in Skipton, which is the one I insisted my parents went to, and I saw it in the Guards Chapel in London. We also worked in partnership with the Foreign Office. There was one at the Embassy in New Zealand, and I was told, this was just before I joined the Imperial War Museum, there was one on the beach in Barbados, which suggests I should have joined earlier and insisted I went. It's as you imagine, an incredibly moving film. But it showed us one thing, is that we wanted, that there was a real desire amongst the organisations to look to the Imperial War Museum and say, do you know what, we liked it when you did that because we had access to your collection, but something that allowed us to tell our own stories and gave us almost like a push into doing that, into exploring a little bit further. We also like the fact you created that national moment and a big project that we could all get involved in. And we don't have we do have another Battle of the Somme. The team made a second film called Battle of Ancre, Advance of the Tanks, and Battle of Ancre was the battle which J.R. Tolkien was part of, and his experience there was one of his formative experiences. And we are making that film available actually to organisations to screen as part of the armistice. But beyond that, we don't have another documentary-length film that's as famous as this. 60-something minutes and onks 76 minutes. You can tell I've said that quite frequently. But again, with a new score from Laura. So we decided, so we had to think, okay, well, this is the feedback, what can we do? And we were aware that within those 4,000 organisations, so many wanted to mark the centenary of the Representation of the People's Act. And when the Battle of the Somme film is great, there are no women in the Battle of the Somme film. And in a lot of the work that we had done, we hadn't really focused on the female experience of the First World War. And this would be the perfect moment to do it. And we had to think, actually, the story of the vote, the story of the suffragettes particularly, is not a very Imperial War Museum story. We don't have a collection that supports particularly the suffragette story, and the cause and consequence of the war and the vote is still a much debated historical question. What we do have, though, is, well, we thought we had some stuff in the collection that related to some of the remarkable women of the First World War. When we started to delve deeper, we had our own remarkable story about women and work and the First World War. And that's why we called this project that we launched, and we're still going because the interest is so great, Women's Work 100. You'll notice no apostrophe. This is because my team are all about 10 years younger than me and don't have the same attachment to grammar that I do. And much of this was delivered over social media, and apparently Twitter's no place for a grammar pedant. They landed themselves a lot more work in terms of doing the social media. What we have at the Imperial War Museum is something called the Women's Work Collection. And it is the collection that was formed between 1918 and 1923, contemporaneously during and just after the war, that marks in enormous detail how women contributed to the First World War and the experiences of women in the First World War. Not just women in England and in the United Kingdom, but across the world, and critically also on the front line too. This is one of our favourite photographs. I hope you can see this a wee bit further back. Drinking tea with her cake on her knee and across an RAF motorbike. We like to think in our team, if 100 years ago we'd been at RAF Duxford when it was formed, that would have been us. We probably would have had the tea and cake. I'm not sure about our ability on a motorbike. So what about the Women's Work Collection? It was formed by two women. I mentioned Sir Martin Conway. This is his daughter, Agnes Conway. This lady here is Lady Priscilla Norman. And when the Imperial War Museum came into being, they very heavily petitioned Sir Martin Conway that said, you cannot just collect the experiences of men, you have to collect the experiences of women. Women are contributing, and this conflict is impacting on their day-to-day lives in a way that has never happened before. If you just collect one experience, that's not an accurate experience, a collection of the war. I would not have argued with either of these two women. They are a complete inspiration, particularly when you start, we have in our archive the correspondence, because it's in the museum's administrative archives, the way in which they kept on at Sir Martin to make sure that women were adequately represented in the fledgling Imperial War Museum. If any of you are archaeologists, you may have heard of Agnes Conway, because after the war she became an eminent archaeologist. And she was, both of them are ferociously well-organised women, and by the time they were setting up what was to be called the Women's Work Subcommittee, which Agnes was the secretary of and Priscilla chaired, they both got very illustrious war contribution stories. They both worked with Belgian refugees. They both found safe passage and homes and work for Belgian refugees. Agnes Conway particularly used her organisation. She was after that, to administer the movement of munitions in Kent, and Kent archives have records of that. And they assembled a committee of similarly remarkable women. They were Lady Mond, which is Violet Mond, obviously Alfred's wife, but she's almost more remarkable than he was, because she herself she was an engineer so much. She also did a lot for Belgian refugees, but she was a real agitator for the start of the Imperial War Museum. Her particular task was to record women working in medicine and in nursing, particularly in the UK, and she wrote to every one of the large houses that were turned into hospitals and asked them to send records of what they were doing. The lady on the other side is Lady Asquith, not the Lady Asquith of the Asquith, the former Prime Minister's wife. This is Ellen Asquith, who again had made quite a contribution to the war effort. They were joined by Lady Haig, by Mrs. Carey Evans, and if anybody knows more about her, I'd love to know. She's the one we can't find much about. Miss Durham, who was a photographer and a kind of explorer, traveller. She knew Eastern Europe very well, and that was to prove particularly critical. And Miss Monkhouse, and I'll give you a little bit more information on Miss Monkhouse later. So they set about acquiring, collecting, cajoling women and their families to do as they had with the back of the ration books to give material to the Imperial War Museum, which means that we have now this incredible collection. So they collected the experiences and approached directly some of the kind of more famous women of the war. So Elsie Knocker and Mary Chisholm, known as the Madonnas of Pervyse. Again, my pronunciation is not great. But they were enthusiastic contributors to the first Imperial War Museum. So not only do we have photographs, and we also have film of them, but they sent their notebooks. They actually sent the door of their dressing station. We no longer have that because it was requisitioned by the War Office in the Second World War because of the metal value. So there was no sentimentality when it came to the Second World War. We also have Mary's breeches. These are on display along with Elsie's notebook at the Imperial War Museum North. And the film that we have is of Mary Chisholm in her breeches, and they're very famous, these two. They went about Belgium in a motorbike and sidecar. And the story of them is absolutely incredible, working with the Belgian Army and the Red Cross. They also approached the sisters. This is Dr. Mary Ingalls. They approached Elsie Ingalls. They approached Mary and Annie, who were her sisters. Elsie Ingalls is one of the most famous women of the First World War. She set up before the First World War the Scottish Women's Hospitals. And when war broke out, she went to London to offer her services and the services of the Scottish Women's Hospitals to the British government. And she was told to go home, dear, and sit still. I would not tell this woman to go home and sit still. And she didn't. So she went to France. She made the same offer, and that was generously accepted. The Scottish Women's Hospital was set up at Roermond, and then she left that in the hands of her kind of trusted doctors and went to Serbia and set up a lot more. She actually developed cancer and died on her return. She was trying to return to Scotland. She got to Newcastle, and she passed away in 1917. There was a big state funeral for her in Edinburgh. We have the correspondence of Agnes writing to her sisters in this firm but very polite way. And that means we have Elsie's handbag, we have her paint box, we have her calling cards, and we have her glasses. They are the smallest glasses I've ever seen. And again, those are on display at Imperial War Museums. But they were very particular. They wanted to record that breadth of experience. And so 10 photographers were commissioned, all women, were commissioned to go and record, to go out to the country and record what women were doing as part of the war efforts. And then they also commissioned a number of artists, including Victoria Monkhouse, who was the Miss Monkhouse of the committee, to create artworks. Some of them were those monumental artworks. Anna Aries are probably the most famous. But then there are these smaller sketches by Victoria Monkhouse. This is one of my favourite images in the whole collection. And they then approached Olive Edis, who was the first female war photographer. Could she go? And she wanted to go, and she was like, this is great photographing women working outside Manchester Victoria Station, but I want to go and record women working on the front line. The War Office was so nervous about this. The armistice was signed before she managed to get out there, but she still persisted, and I'm really glad she did, because this is a very rare record of what was happening on the battlefields in that period between armistice and peace. And it's where you find soldiers returning, but women working for, in this case, the Friends War Victims Relief Committee, but also the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, where you find them working alongside the Labour Corps, the Chinese Labour Corps particularly, who had the gruesome job of clearing the battlefields. So this is women's contribution to rural life, both in northern France and in the UK and Ireland, is one of the least documented aspects of women's war work. So Olive, a very important kind of figure. If you are interested in her, Cromer Museum have her whole collection, because her last assistant, when she was based in Cromer, died in the last 10 years. He was very young when he worked with her, and gave the entire collection to Cromer Museum. And they've worked with us through the centenary to do a big touring exhibition that tours around Norfolk of the story of Olive Edith. So I mentioned that the first Imperial War Museum display was at the Burlington House in the Royal Academy. There are some amazing internal correspondence where Agnes describes this as an utter fiasco, and because they were fighting to maintain space in that first collection. But you can see the wealth of material that the committee had collected, and this is only 1918. So, having been slightly dissatisfied with how much space they were given in the first display, they decided to go and do their own. I love their spirit. And they approached Campbell Ross at the Whitechapel Gallery, and he gave them 2 floors for 6 weeks. They did the first ever women's war work exhibition. On the ground floor was the collection, and also a shrine that Lady Norman made, which had pictures of women who had been killed in the course of war work. And then upstairs was the Women's Uniform Service, and all of that material came into the Imperial War Museum collection. They were visited by the Queen and her daughter, and 82,000 people visited in 6 weeks. And if we got 82,000 people in 6 weeks now, we would be unbelievably happy. There was a really remarkable reaction, and it meant that more people, because they've not seen their stories reflected, started to send in letters, pictures, or get pictures developed. So this is just a letter I picked out from Belfast where she says, as soon as I receive the photograph from the London photographers, I will send it to you. So people commissioning photographs of of the women in their family, friends and family. What did we do with it? Well, we took 50 of those images and we made them freely available to members of the Centenary Partnership to do with whatever they liked, as long as it was a non-commercial purpose. So they could put on their own exhibition, they could use them in books, they could use them in youth projects. Probably the most impressive one I saw was a group of young women from Bradford who took the Olive Edith story about women war photographers and did an enormous study and created what I think is one of the most beautiful books that anyone has produced for the centenary of the First World War, called No Man's Land. And we also designed this kind of treatment to some of the photographs. We had kind of 4 photographs that we used. We turned it into a social media campaign, and that was our initial thought, that over 6 weeks between the centenary of the Representation of the People's Act and International Women's Day, that we would, over our social media platforms, tell as many stories, not just the stories from the Imperial War Museum collections and pull these out of the archives and the stores, but that we would ask other organisations to say, please tell your stories, so that the public there's a greater public understanding of what women did during the war. This is a coke heaver, and this image was also used by a university in Hertfordshire, the University of Hertfordshire rather, because they did an exhibition at the same time by the German photographer Katja Buckler, who was quite a well-known German photographer, and she was commissioned to also take, as Olive Edith was, photographs of women working, and she has an almost identical photograph of this. And there's another one it's almost quite spooky. These are women who would never have met. These are some of the photographs that we made available. So these are the football team one. I love this because you might not be able to see it, just how, I don't know if she's the physio or the manager, the nurse and the matron, but just how cross she looks. But that's been a really much used one. This one's been used a lot because it's, again, something IWM has that others don't, because it's come from the official War Office. There are very few depictions of the women who worked in administration. And then this one, which you can't really see, but she's been used a lot because, yes, it's a picture of a munitions worker, but her sleeve is rolled up to display a tattoo of her sweetheart who died at the front. And we're using that. We really did unearth that out of the archives, and that's now in our Lest We Forget exhibition at Manchester, to show just how people commemorated and remembered those who had fallen. So that the photographs are still uncovering layers and stories, but it's other organisations who talk.
Question about the photograph before that. It looks like a girl
Yes. So younger women were used as messengers. The Girl Guides were also used as messengers. The Scouts were, but they weren't. They were less. How can I put this? Disciplined. So yes, they're very young. So probably we think she's about 14. So yes, they were very young. And I think that's probably why that picture's been used so regularly as well. It's great for me. I go to different exhibitions, events, and books, etc. Social media campaigns, concerts where these are used as the backdrop, and to see these three women in so many different contexts, in so many different parts of the UK and Ireland is really something. We also turned these into, inspired by the fact that there was a women's work exhibition, that we created our own one that you could download. So it didn't matter if you were a tent in a field or if you were a museum. You won't be able to, as I said, borrow a field gun or GAST, but you could download these and hold your own women's work exhibitions. And we had a few of those around the country. The social media campaign was really successful. It was our most successful social media campaign for the first third of the year. We had something like 130,000 views on our Facebook page on International Women's Day with this material. But it meant we could tell these stories that otherwise would not have come to light. So Brookland, the top left is Brooklands in Weybridge, which I mentioned in Guy's talk, of the women who were there both at the Royal Air Force but also medical women who were working on that huge site at Brooklands. These are we work with Cumbria Archives to tell the story of the ladies of Cleator Moor. They were working in the mill in Cleator Moor. Their story is particularly remarkable because they petitioned for equal pay with men and won. And this is them on their celebratory picnic to St Bees Head. So where my gran is from, and it is the windiest place on the planet, how on earth those hats are staying on is beyond me. The ladies at the top are in the jute mill in Dundee. Jute making was incredibly dangerous through the war because it was so flammable. You'll notice that's actually, with the bunting in the background, that's actually taken during the coronation. In the 1950s, and that's their reunion. They worked for something like a combination of 180 years, that group of women in that jute mill. And then I like to include this Letterkenny Guild to show that kind of home front, because these women knitted the most incredible number of socks that were sent, and then mittens and shirts and stuff like that. But essentially, the sock production in Donegal was quite phenomenal. But where else would we tell that story if we hadn't worked with the archives in Donegal to tell it? I mentioned that you can still, because all this material is still available to use, host your own women's work exhibition. So the 5,000 people saw that one in Gateshead. And we also put a package of films together because I mentioned that film, the response to the Battle of the Somme. We have this incredible film archive, and we have a package of films, freely available for organisations to hold their own film screening. And we thought we'd do 3 of those in International Women's Week. We've got 30, and we did one last night at Arnos Vale Cemetery in Bristol. So there are all sorts of organisations using those as the opportunity to tell their story for the First World War. Obviously, the last bit that we're coming to now is marking the armistice and the 100 days. So we thought, after the success of telling stories of women in the First World War, we wanted to make sure we told a real breadth of stories for these last 100 days. We're working with an organisation called 26, who are a literary organisation, to commission 100 writers to each write a piece of work of 100 words, which we've called a centenary, and they will be each about one story of one person who experienced the First World War. So 100 individuals. We are then releasing each one of those over the last 100 days of the conflict. Today is day 15, and today's subject is Olivedus, which was a little bit of which I'd love to say I planned, having talked about Olivedus this afternoon. It was a bit of an accident. And each of those, which we're releasing over our website, 1914.org, and the social media platforms at IWM_Centenary. Each of those will also tell a story of an organisation that's inspired the writer. Now, I would urge you to look at them, to read the writers, the stories that inspired the writers, and to read about the stories of how different organisations have commemorated the centenary. And And we've purposefully mixed them up, so they are both stories of known, very famous people, of men and women, but those who are only really known in their families. And the whole point is that this is probably the first recorded conflict. It was the first conflict that was filmed. It was the first conflict that was extensively photographed. It's the first conflict where there was a museum and there were many collections which asked for material, which collected material relating. There was a huge amount of material there to document the First World War. And the whole point of doing this project is very much like the whole point of the Women's Work Subcommittee and the whole point of what Sir Martin Conway wished to achieve in 1917, which is to take those stories out of family history, out of those shoe boxes that are in all of our lofts that get taken down once every 10 years and the stories retold, and to take them out of museums and the stores and the archives and to bring them to much greater public attention. Now, my poetry reading and pronunciation you have all already experienced, but I wanted to leave you with two stories of women in the First World War. This is written by Miranda Dickinson. I should say our writers are a mixture of professional novelists, as Miranda is, and students, and those who write. Her head of marketing for McLaren is one of them. So they're a real mixture, and they've all done this voluntarily. But this is the story of Gertrude Evelyn Ellis, and it's the poem, the Centenary rather, documents her after her wedding, where her husband was not allowed or not able to take long enough leave to be able to have their wedding portraits taken. And so she is having her wedding portrait taken on her own whilst he has gone back to the front. I wait alone. The lilies in my hand tremble, but the studio is still. I've hidden your letter in my shoe, for look. The one with your sketch of the dress I know where. 48 hours leave was long enough to make me Mrs. Ellis, but not our photograph. Ready now, Mr. Watson says, holding the flash. His son is fighting in France too. I'm scared, Fred, but I smile my brightest for both of us. I will carry on our dreams whilst you are gone. Always your bride, forever your Evelyn. Praying you home. Please come home. I wait alone. And this last one is I wanted to find, because we're releasing them every day. So this is one of our Irish stories that has been told. We've got a lot of Irish writers in this 100. I don't know what it is. But the last one is written by a lady called Therese Kieran. And as I say, all of our centenary has been about trying to tell us the broader breadth of stories as possible and pulling out some of those hidden histories. And this is about Belgian refugees who settled in Monaghan, 15 Belgian refugees, female refugees who settled in Monaghan. And she used the collection of the Irish Linen Centre and Monaghan archives to inspire, and Teresa went into enormous amounts of detail, which gratifying for us, she told The Guardian when they covered this a couple of weekends ago. A needle's eye threw her a lifeline between finger and thumb. She pinched silver to make a little gold, told her story via business card. Jean Deneve and Sisters, Belgian embroiderers, Leighton Meline. To Ireland's muddy hem she trailed a running stitch, each stitch a step from Mechlin to Monaghan, each stitch a suitor mending hearts of women, of men. She knew the good of soft tarantule on skin, trained local women, helped Belbroid spread its wings, clung to kith and kin, refugees. She never knew they'd be, their French knots undone, in history making, steely through a needle's eye. Please do follow the writers. If you if you have stories, please upload them to Lives of the First World War, because that archive will rest in IWM forever. And if you have the wish and ability to screen, as I said, those two films, then do ask me, and I can tell you more about how we do those. But thank you very much.